Katerina Jaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review. This is Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea. Now, before we get on to the meat of the show, we want to fulfill a promise that we made last week to visit the actual unemployment rate as compared with the official unemployment rate. Bottom line here is that we are being lied to. So I'm going to share some slides and let's see if we can get this to work here. There we go. There. Now, hopefully, this is going to work out to where people can see it. Okay. And actually, before I get to this, I want to just go over a few details here. In the early 1980s, under the Reagan regime, the methods used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for calculating unemployment changed deliberately at Reagan's command. Prior to that, you got a fairly good, accurate count of the actual unemployed. So, for example, the figures from the 1930s Great Depression were fairly reliable, or are fairly reliable. It's not reliable to compare those figures with the official figures today because they're calculated in much different ways, and include much different categories of unemployed. After the 1980s, many categories of actually unemployed people were no longer counted, including the so-called discouraged workers. The actual unemployment rate since the turn of the century has been at least twice as high as the official numbers. And in these special COVID-plagued times, it's above 3 times the official number. In the early 90s, under the Clinton regime, the official government calculations were again changed to further massage the public impact to further distort the numbers. The upshot? The government is lying to us about real unemployment and the real unemployment rate. The official unemployment rate fell in September from a record peak of 14.7% at the height of the COVID plague to 7.9%. However, also in September, 700,000 people gave up looking for work, became discouraged by the impossibility of the task, and they were not counted, just as the hundreds of thousands who went back to school or became housewives or house husbands after being unable to find work were not counted. Overall, during the COVID plague, 4.4 million people have joined the already bloated army of discouraged unemployed. But none of those people are counted in the official U3 rate. And a total U.S. labor force of 164.5 in February dropped in November to 160.1 million. So you can see a drastic drop there. Millions of people just dropped off the rolls of officially unemployed and were no longer counted. That is a downward trend that has been plaguing the American economy since prior to the turn of the century. So, there you have it. I want to go on now and show you some statistics. Let's see if we can get this up here. There. Here, I guess all we have to do is share this. Right there. And this stuff should come popping up. There we go. As you can see from this slide, the unemployment rate, the official U3 and U6 numbers. U3 is the number that the politicians use that they'll tell you all the time. The current number is 7.9%. That's the number that the mass media pushes at you constantly. That's the lie. That is not a real number. Then there's the U6. The U3 is the red one right here. The U6 is the gray one right here. U6 includes a couple of categories that the official U3 does not include. That's also an official number, but never, not normally reported to the mass media. And then we have, finally, the shadow stat. And this is a statistic kept by a person who's dedicated his life to this work. And as you can see, the at the start, or sometime during 1990, this number, actually all three of these numbers started to rise. The U.S. government has identified the last quarter, the last 4 months of 2019, actually, as the beginning of this rise in unemployment. As you can see, at that time, they were reporting 4% unemployment, which is an absurd number, it's not real. And this peaked around July of this year at around 15%. That's the official number. The U6 number peaked at about 22 to 23%. The real unemployment, as reported by shadow statistics, and shadow statistics includes all the categories of actually unemployed people. As we can see here, that number rose to 36% unemployed in the United States, and has fallen since then to the current rate of about between 26 and 27%. So there you can see with this astounding slide that we are being lied to. I also want to show you the gross domestic product annual growth rate since the early 1980s. And this number is really reflective, more than any other number probably, of the health of the entire economy. And we can see that starting in the early 2000s, during the dot-com bust or crash, whatever you want to call it, it took a huge dip, but it was temporary between 2001 and 2004. And it dipped below, this growth rate for the U.S. economy dipped below 0%. So it was negative. It was in negative territory. It wasn't just growing, it was shrinking. And then, starting around 2007, we can see it dipped back down into negative territory. And that it's been, according to the shadow stat, it's been in negative territory ever since. So we have been in what I call a long depression since 2007. As we can see, this got really drastically bad around 2009 with the negative growth rate of more than negative 5%. Came up for a while, but was still negative, still in depression territory from 2011 till last year. And starting last year and a little bit the year before, we start seeing a dip in this number. And we come to the last quarter of 2019, and that's when the dip really begins. And then it gets steeper and steeper, a steeper plunge as we get into the COVID-19 pandemic, to the point where today this number is about a negative 13%. That's the most drastic economic downturn in American history, recorded history at least. That is a dire, drastic, deep, dark depression. You might even call this a dark age, a new dark age, because it's worse than a depression. It's a depression compounded by all kinds of other nastiness. So another rate I wanted to show you real quickly. This is the U.S. money supply. And as we can see, starting in 2019, the money supply started going up as they started using what's called quantitative easing. Another name for that, what I call it, is helicopter money. Because basically what this is the Federal Reserve System, a private bank cooperatively owned by the major banks, essentially creating new money and showering it, like dropping it from a helicopter down on the big banks and the big corporations. Now we can see here, when we come up to the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of the COVID plague, it had already been going up during the whole year of 2019, but it started shooting up during pandemic as government, U.S. federal government, the Congress granted the so-called CARES Act, which was the biggest transfer of wealth from the working class to the super rich in the history of humankind, bar none. It peaked out at about 26, let's see, about money growth up 26%, quite drastic. And it started coming down just in the last couple of months. But this is an enormous amount of money to pump into the economy, especially when you consider the fact that other than the measly $1,200 that they sent out to people, very little of this has gone to the working class. Almost the entirety of this money has gone to the rich, to the super rich, to the big banks and big corporations. So next, and as a result, direct result of that last slide, we can see inflation, which the official number was at the beginning of 2020 at 0. And inflation, the official rate, is now reported to be about a little more than 1.5, 1.75%. However, the actual inflation rate, as reported by shadow statistics, shows us that the unemployment rate, that the inflation rate has been going up, and that it has climbed now in real life, in your life and my life, to about 8%. So we're at about real numbers, about 8% inflation, and that's quite a sizable difference from the less than 2% that the federal government is. This is eating away at your standard of living, basically, at your buying power, at the amount of goods and services that each dollar you bring home can buy. And how do they get away with reporting these numbers, this number, this rate of inflation? They get away with it simply by not including broad categories of real inflationary activity that affect you and me. They just don't include it in the numbers. Same as what they did with unemployment. So there you have it. Wanted to give people a chance to take a look at the real rate, and as you can see, it is astounding. Right. So that's it. On to the next topic.
then of course Trump, you constantly bragged about the stock market, and he was citing these dishonest unemployment numbers to try to substantiate this, claim that he was helping all these factions of the working class, and giving all these people jobs, and he had built up the greatest, built up the economy that the U.S. economy has never been built up before. But this whole time, it was just deteriorating, even before the pandemic, and then in March of 2020, I mean, it looked unprecedented. It was incredible to see this almost vertical line upward.
It is unprecedented.
And then since then, it's gone back to like seemingly over 25% unemployment.
But that's the normal.
Well, it still seems like it's at least 5% higher than what was the norm in the initial years after 2008.
The norm was around 14-15%.
So
quite a bit higher than that.
The economic paradigm it's certainly shifted into an unprecedented crisis mode, and I'm interested in seeing where it's going to lead to in the coming months and years. It seems like it's going to level out for a time. I wonder where it will, at what point it will start to level out. I see that it's starting to kind of move a little bit towards stagnating eventually, but of course I've been seeing news of unemployment claims continuing to be filed in certain places, especially like Massachusetts, and so there's certainly contradictory information that you can find about the unemployment rate. The government claims that it's at 8%, which is it's incredible how dishonest their version is.
Yeah,
it's incredible. So maybe it'll stabilize at around like somewhere between 20 and 15%, and then the next crisis will hit, whether this crisis is something like a crash for the dollar, which will probably happen next year, or a facet of the climate crisis that's bigger than anything we've encountered so far. What would happen if I'm waiting for it every year. How big is this fire going to be? How big is this next hurricane going to be? And the continued prevalence of COVID-19, I think, is what's going to really keep the rate higher even than it was at any time in the 2010s, because COVID-19 isn't going. It's now a normal part of American life because of the nature of the neoliberal socioeconomic system that forces people to intermingle with this virus. And of course, there's this vast reactionary segment that's anti-mask, and that thinks it's a hoax even after the president got it. So this country is going to continue to roll around in the poison it's made for itself, until the contradictions of capitalism heighten to the point where enough people agree that proletarian revolution is a practical necessity. Yeah. This needs to be the message that we put forth. Proletarian revolution is a practical necessity. Your only alternative is to continue to live in this country with at least 25% unemployment, and your living standards are going to continue to decline. In this last year alone, hunger has tripled in the U.S., with children now being four 14 times more likely than they were last year to not be with enough food.
Right. Yes, couldn't have said it better myself, and that is exactly the conclusion that I predict that more and more people over the next couple of years are going to draw that conclusion that you just drew, that this can't go on. Hell, we've got to respond to this, and the only reasonable way to respond is through revolutionary action. Reform would be great if we could get it. Oh man, how we would all love to get reforms. But for the last 40 years, during the whole entire neoliberal era, reform has been shut down. No reforms that benefit the working class have been allowed through. They just they don't happen anymore. They did when I was a young man, but not anymore.
Yeah, like
So,
LBJ, the Great Society,
right,
and these they were trying to expand on the New Deal, but then the 1970s economic crash happened, and it became so that, in Margaret Thatcher's word, there was no alternative from the perspective of the capitalists to implement this new paradigm of austerity and privatization and regressive tax and all these moves to redistribute wealth upward, and
exactly.
all for the purpose of foisting the costs of the economic crises, foisting the costs of global capitalism's economic contraction onto the poor, so that the rich could continue to have a rising profit rate.
Yes.
This
For
amazingly, this is still the case. Amazingly, the wealthiest Americans, these billionaires, are continuing to add on to their wealth faster than ever, it seems, within this last year.
And among the liberals and the neocons, the discussion is all about reset. What they think that they're going to do is reset back to the old normal of neoliberalism, of severe austerity, of the severe single-sided class war on the working class. That's their solution, and that's the only solution that they have. That's what they come up with. They want to go back to the normal, and yet that normal can no longer be reached. People will not go for that anymore. They're going to have more and more eruptions, just like they've had over the last year. We've seen eruptions all over the world of people out protesting neoliberalism. And the identity of Black Lives Matter is that it's about fighting the police state. However, a whole hell of a lot of the people involved in that, of the tens of millions who were out marching in 70% of the counties in the country, raised anti-neoliberal issues as well when they were out there. So they're conscious. They know that this is much broader than just fighting the police state, and that the police state is not their only problem. So anyway, next on the list, Bolivia's coming election must not be stolen like the last. That, according to Morning Star, which is a communist newspaper. It's the oldest and really largest communist daily newspaper in Great Britain. Was started originally by the Communist Party of Great Britain. And then Bolivia heads for its violent moment of reckoning by our own Rainer Shea. So Rainer, why don't you tell us about this? Later on, I'll fill in any holes if we need to about the Morning Star article, which is actually an editorial of the newspaper, which is quite good. But I want to get first to your take on the coming moments in Bolivia. We know that the election is supposed to take place in October 18th or on October 18th?
Last month, the illegitimate coup president of Bolivia, Janine Áñez, withdrew from the election with the hopes that the anti-socialist candidates would be more unified. Though this has kind of backfired because Janine Áñez is still technically on the ballot. So this was clumsy. And so the Bolivian ruling class, and by extension the U.S. imperialists, are concerned that they're going to lose control over Bolivia, that they're going to lose Bolivia as a neo-colony of Washington when the socialists get elected into power again. So they've been mobilizing to try to disqualify the socialists, and their initial approach, as supported both by the hard right and by the liberal right within Bolivia, has been to use these trumped up charges about how the socialist candidate was like he spoke at the wrong time, or it was it sounded like BS when I heard the supposed rule violation of his described. So it is BS. If it sounds like BS in this situation, it must be BS. So if this doesn't work, if the Bolivia's election court doesn't disqualify the socialists, then they're going to resort to more drastic measures of having their paramilitaries plant bombs within the hotels where election observers will stay. I don't know if this entails actually setting off the bombs, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did something so dramatic just so that they could get the dramatic image to pin the blame on the movement for socialism, and so what they're planning to do is carry out a series of false flag bomb threats that are blamed on the socialists, so that they can disqualify the socialists and enact further repression. So I guess this is the extent of my knowledge about it. I got to stand by every day now for the latest updates. I mean, who knows where this could go? And maybe the reactionaries will fail. Maybe the socialists will manage somehow to get their guy elected. But if these instruments of the capitalist state within Venezuela prove themselves to be strong enough to triumph in this case, then immediately the social movements are going to get back into gear with protests and blockades, and they're ready to escalate to armed struggle. So the social movements are this close to exhausting all peaceful options for restoring democracy. And we'll see within this next week whether it's going to be peaceful or whether it's going to escalate essentially into a civil war that can only rightly end with Janine Áñez or her successor being forced, or her capitalist successor being forced to flee the country, and them hopefully having some kind of proletarian revolution. I mean, I've been contemplating what the outcome after then would be, what the outcome in Bolivia would be if these social movements are forced to overthrow the government themselves. Either it will be an outright proletarian revolution, Cuba style, or it'll be something resembling the overthrow of Sudan's dictatorship last year, where there's this transitional government, and we're not sure whether the socialists or whether some more regressive factions will ultimately gain power. It's off. Muted.
Sorry about that. I started talking without unmuting myself. I didn't want to make any distracting noises on you. Okay, the Morning Star editorial. You can do a Google or a DuckDuckGo search. You can DuckDuckGo it. That's what I do, and that's what I recommend. Or whatever your favorite search engine, Bing or Yahoo or whatever. You can search for Morning Star, 2 words. It's a British communist newspaper. On the masthead it says "For the People and Socialism." Anyway, it's a great newspaper. I've often looked at it. And in this editorial, they say, scenes outside the Bolivian court that decided not to stop the movement towards socialism standing in this month's elections are a taster, kind of like a taste, I guess they say in Britain, taster, of how the right will react to its likely victory. There's an article here that you can link to called "Attack Thugs Attacked Moss Supporters." That's the movement towards socialism. Gathered awaiting the verdict with firecrackers and baseball bats. That's some of what the supporters of Moss have had to put up with since their president last October or November, I guess it was deposed in a bloody CIA-led and U.S.-sponsored coup d'etat, right-wing coup d'etat against the legitimate Moss government. They go on to say the court ruling is a victory, but not an indication that the election will proceed fairly. Rayner talked about some of the things that these right-wing forces are doing and will try to do in the future. The article also talks about the turncoat Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno, elected on a platform committed to continuing his predecessor Rafael Correa's socialist policies, has driven his former leader into exile. So Correa can't even come into Ecuador now. Anyway, they go on to talk about Brazil and the right-wing rise there. And they say, despite the headline of this editorial, about the election must not be allowed to be stolen and all that stuff, they basically come to the conclusion that the right wing will do everything in their power to try to steal the election. The election will definitely not be fair. We will have to keep an eye on this for the long run. And in the meantime, like you say, keep up on it every day. Keep looking for everything that's happening there. Now, topic number 3, China news. This is all in China news. A lot going on from China in the last week. China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, 22 other countries accused the U.S. of systematic racial discrimination in a protest or in a resolution at the United Nations. And then we'll move to America's sanction diplomacy tramples on international rules. And finally, President Xi Jinping's philosophy on people-centered development. So I wanted to just briefly touch on all 3 of those stories, which I think are pretty important stories. Let's see if I can get this up here. First, let me just start, because that's for the one that I've got here. First of all, I want to start with Xi Jinping's on people-centered development philosophy. Now, this comes from his latest book titled "The Governance of China," and this is the third volume in this series by President Xi on the governance of China. Anyway, this was published recently, and on it, Xi touches on his philosophy about how to help to develop people in his Communist Party-led country, in his socialist country. First of all, Xi says the people are the creators of history. They are the fundamental force that determines our party and country's future. And he goes on, to ensure that the people enjoy a happy life is the ultimate goal of all our work and is an important manifestation of our party's fundamental purpose of serving people wholeheartedly. Then he says, public support, approval, and satisfaction depend not only on what we say, but on what we do. And finally, he says, complacency, laxity, muddling through one's work, considering self-interest first in the face of difficulties, and making half-hearted efforts are all incompatible with the needs of the people and the demands of the new era. Finally, he says, I will fully commit to the people and never fail them. And then moving on to this is an editorial from this morning, actually, from the People's Daily Online, which is the communist newspaper. This is their English language version, but the official communist newspaper, daily newspaper, as it says in the title, of the Communist Party of China, the CPC. In this, they talk about the fact that, well, here, I'll just read this. Statistics from the monthly magazine, The Atlantic. People probably have seen that magazine. It's a big U.S. magazine. The Atlantic show that the U.S. has 7,967 sanctions in place as of May 3rd, 2019, according to the statistics of the law firm Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. The U.S. government has imposed a total of more than 3,200 sanctions on foreign entities and individuals just from 2017 to 2019. That's quite incredible. And the problem is with most of these sanctions, they are not sanctions that are endorsed or issued by the United Nations. And the international law is pretty clear on this. Sanctions outside of countries that are in declared wars with one another, sanctions by one country unilaterally, such as the United States does with this ridiculous 7,967 sanctions on various countries, those are illegal. Those are acts of war, but they're done by a country that has not declared war on any of these people. Congress, in fact, has not declared war since December 7th, 1941. So every war that the United States has been involved in, and we all know how many that is, more than 60 wars of conquest, imperialist wars, wars of regime change since that time, they are illegal. wars. They're violations of international law, of international treaties that the American government has been signatory to, they signed these treaties. So they're violating what they've signed, they're violating what they agreed to, they're violating the international law. The most recent of these sanctions has been on Iran. On October 8th, the United States announced to impose a new round of sanctions on Iran, putting 18 major Iranian banks on the blacklist. Now, this has effectively iced out all Iranian banks, all the major Iranian banks, from participating in the the U.S. created back in the 50s international financial system, which depends on banks being able to transfer money to one another. And they can't do that in Iran if they're sanctioned by the U.S. in illegal sanctions that are not coming from the United Nations. And what's worse is the United States will issue secondary sanctions on any companies from other countries that do business with these Iranian banks or with Iran in general. So this is basically what this editorial that's by Yi Zhu in this morning's People's Daily Online. You can DuckDuckGo it to find it online and read it yourself. But it's quite a good article. I just wanted to mention that. And finally, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, 22 others accuse the U.S. of systemic racial discrimination at the UN. China's United Nations ambassador Zhang Jun read a statement at the United Nations last Monday denouncing the U.S. for systemic racial discrimination and violence, which this statement was endorsed by 25 other countries. And just this one quote, and then I'll be done. Instances like the death of George Floyd and the shooting of Jacob Blake continue to take place, and vulnerable people continue to suffer or lose their lives to racism and police brutality, Zhang said in a prepared statement presenting China and the 25 other nations, or representing, China and the other 25 nations, which include Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So more instances of the United States violating international law. The United States is really a rogue nation. It's an outlaw nation. It really needs to be reined in. This editorial does a really good job in bringing that up. So Rainer, thoughts?
All of this, when you mentioned how there have been like 60 or so wars, at least, that the United States has engaged in these last few generations, all for the purpose of fortifying the U.S. capitalism. And when you mention this Cold War against China that's perpetuated through constant lying propaganda coming from the U.S. State Department and from U.S. media institutions, I thought of how analogous this is to the world described in Orwell's 1984, except the thing about Orwell's 1984 is that it was essentially a piece of Cold War anti-communist propaganda that envisioned a future dystopian future where society is so economically deprived, and life is filled with lies and propaganda and constant surveillance, and militarism squelches out independent thought, and there's constant war and alienation from society, and really a nihilistic worldview that's propagated by the ruling institutions to prop up this illegitimate despotism. So this is the anti-communist dystopian propaganda piece that makes up Orwell's 1984, which was really an extension of his more blatant anti-communist propaganda book, Animal Farm. We see what capitalism is like today, and we see how this parallels so ironically these kinds of anti-communist caricatures that have been propagated by liberal and reactionary writers. So this is the reality that we're living in. We're living in what the dominant culture has always warned us communism would lead us to. And I mean, look at what the world has become, square in the face, and recognize what's happened, how our society has been fooled over these decades, as the wars have dragged on, and as inequality has increased, and you've been fed lies after lie after lie.
Exactly. And that's a great segue, actually, into our next couple of topics. I'm going to step away for just a minute, but hopefully I'll be back to hear most of this. And I've read the two articles already, both from Rainer Shea, that you're going to start describing next. First is the first topic, number 4. Will anti-colonial revolution come before socialist revolution? Now, in the actual article, it says anti-colonial revolution will come before socialist revolution, but I put that will in there because I have a few questions about that. But so just to be clear on what the actual article said. And then topic 5, fascism is capitalism's only way of surviving, which is actually exactly what you were just saying, in not so many words, in your response to the China news. So, Rainer, take it away.
Yes. Now, when I say that, I think that what I'm saying is that in the continent currently called North America, anti-colonial revolution is going to technically come before socialist revolution, and this is really just going by the basic logic that before the communist parties can carry out their preferred actions and implement socialism on this continent, the colonial contradiction is going to have to be sorted out, and all the land is going to have to be returned to the indigenous First Nations peoples. With this article, I am not trying to dilute the importance of proletarian revolution. I think that real anti-colonial revolution won't be achieved until there's also a socialist revolution, because we see how neocolonialism is able to be utilized by the imperialist countries to sort of recolonize countries that have technically been decolonized. What I'm saying with this article is that decolonization is decolonization in the sense that the land is returned to the control of the indigenous peoples should be the first step in the revolution against the United States on this continent. after the U.S. is overthrown, the first step before implementing socialism should be to abolish these county and state borders that the U.S. has constructed, and abolish a central government that can control the affairs of all these nations, and return all the land, like give the indigenous peoples the ultimate say in how this land is carved up, and after then can come the implement the proletarian revolutions, the efforts by the communists within these nations to carry out proletarian revolution within these nations, and the settler socialists who are skeptical of decolonization, I've seen they've kind of been aghast at these kinds of ideas, like claiming that full decolonization will harm the chances for socialist revolution. But think about the kind of scenario that I'm describing. Think about a scenario likely decades from now where the socialist movement on this continent, in partnership with the indigenous movement, has successfully overthrown the United States government, and this has come most definitely after decades of increasing economic deprivation under neoliberalism and decades of worsening climate collapse and all these crises and atrocities of capitalism. And in this scenario, I think that it's likely that by their own accord, these indigenous First Nations will come to agree with the goals of the movement towards proletarian revolution. I mean, in my article, I quote someone, this native from what's now called Canada. His name is their name is Brooks Arcand Paul, and they say that in their opinion, the land back movement should include the defeat of the elements of settler colonial society, which seek to carry out violent capitalist extraction of resources and capitalist exploitation. So we can already see how within this land back movement, there's a strong anti-capitalist undercurrent. And this is no surprise because capitalism and colonialism have gone hand in hand. I mean, capitalism is the reason why there was this incentive by the European powers to expand into this continent and to carry out this genocide for the purpose of creating a so-called new Europe and advancing capitalist interests. So I think that given these overlapping contradictions, the capitalist contradiction and the colonial contradiction, I think that technically speaking, anti-colonial revolution will come before socialist revolution on this continent. And going by this logic, the same could apply to Australia, New Zealand, and the other settler colonial states around the world.
Okay. That gives us a lot to chew on. The reason that I put this as kind of a question rather than the affirmative statement that you put it in is that at this time, among indigenous people of the Americas, among the former slave population, among the conquered Mexican population, which includes, and that's an enormous amount of people as well. brown people, black people, and red people, some might call it. I see absolutely no movement in this direction at all, other than a tiny, tiny number of peripheral people that do not at all represent their people. What I see is a lot of radicalization among these oppressed nationalities. What I see is that they're not so much interested in doing doing a nationalist, anti-colonialist revolution for liberation. And you know what? If they were, I am a firm supporter, like Lenin, of the idea of self-determination. This is up to those people. It is not my place as a Euro-American. It is not my place to be telling them what their goals should be. But what I see is an increased radicalization, just like with the entire working class, more so even because these people are and have always been at the forefront of the working class movement in this country. And I see they are determined to lead a socialist revolution. I mean, even there, it's a minority of the people that have this communist consciousness, but they're moving in that socialist direction. They are just like the rest of the American working class, in which the majority of the working class have become socialists. They are moving in that direction. That's what I see. And as a Leninist, as a Marxist-Leninist who is firmly committed to self-determination of oppressed nationalities, I think that it's our place to support these people, what they want, what they say they want. So those are my observations. I could be turned on this question. I could be won over. And Rainer, I listen to you all the time because I think you're a brilliant young man who's way beyond in his thinking and in his being a vanguard of the youth. I think you're way beyond most youth I know, the overwhelming majority of youth I know. So I will continue to listen to you, but that's my reaction on first blush.
Yeah,
And
well,
we should definitely talk more about this in the coming months and, see where it ends up.
I get my line. The line that I just described comes directly from some of the indigenous communists who I've talked to, and to somebody I know in particular who's as committed as I am to looking into what rectification, what it would look like to rectify these injustices and to address the colonial contradiction properly. And I've heard from him over and over that like from the first day that I met him last year, he articulated a vision to first abolish the U.S. government, then return all the land to the indigenous First Nations, and to have in the United States alone all 573 indigenous nations to have full control over their land, and the details of this would have to be worked out. I'm sure if these nations came under threat from an outside power, they'd have to form some kind of military alliance. But in terms of their individual political systems, it's I think it's important for communists not to frame a revolution on this continent as having to be monolithic, as if it would be, as if we were England or Germany. It's more complicated. The presence of colonialism makes it more complicated than that. And there are all these nations with their individual opinions of the people within them, and to try to bypass that and impose socialism on them from a central power within the continent wouldn't be just. I think that the goal of the communists after in this post-colonial scenario would be to make their case, to agitate, and to do so while respecting this new paradigm of full sovereignty.
Well, this will be easy to figure out come the revolution. And I don't think,
Yeah.
by the way, I don't think our revolution will be monolithic by any means. It'll be pretty fucking messy and pretty scattered, if anything. And that's why a Marxist-Leninist organization is necessary to lend some cohesiveness and some political consciousness, some Marxist ideas to the direction of it. Because if it was just sprang up out of nothing, which is what most of these things start as, what all of them start as, oh God, it would be going off in 1,000 different directions, many of them contradictory to one another. Yeah, I don't think we'll ever see monolithic. That's not in the cards. But in a successful revolution that overthrows the illegitimate powers, the illicit powers, the capitalist class first and foremost, and its institutions. After that's done, it will be quite easy to see where the to allow or to encourage referendums among all these indigenous nations, also among the Black communities in this country and the Chicano communities in this country. Allow them or encourage them, stand out of the way for them to hold referendums to get in touch with their own people and see where their own people are at. Plenty of time to have discussion, to sway opinion, and then a vote. That's the way it should be done. That's authentic self-determination. In any case, we've got a lot left to go, so I want to move on to the next topic. But beforehand, I just want to say, it'd be great if we could get your friend, your indigenous friend, to come on the show. And you know, we could have a really good discussion with him. Maybe I'll learn something. Maybe even you'll learn some more from it. And I'd love to have that discussion. Anyway, the next topic, which, as I said, you'd already done the segue into this, fascism is capitalism's only way of surviving.
Right. I mean, you look at the history of the last century, you see how as capitalism has begun to collapse, first seemingly in the form of World War I and all the disaster that came from it, and then in the Great Depression, and in all these ways that the system had imploded in on itself and created all these declines in living standards and dysfunctionality. You see how the system has adapted by various forms of fascism. Because remember that according to social fascist theory, there's the more extreme wing of fascism in the Hitler and Mussolini types, and then there's the moderate wing of fascism in social democrats who use social welfare policies to prop up the capitalist imperialist power structure. Which I think is why George Jackson, as I mentioned in my article, said that that his personal definition of fascism equates to reform. That fascism is capitalism's way of reforming itself into a continuation in the face of crisis and in the face of these perpetual contradictions that capitalism creates for itself. So now, amid these crises that you've illustrated so dramatically with these charts of seemingly perpetually shrinking economic growth and unemployment above 25% in the U.S. alone, and you know, I saw this report that said something like 100 million people around the world have been forced into extreme poverty due to COVID-19 related economic matters, and so we see these crises, and in addition to the climate crisis, and in addition to the decline of U.S. hegemony, that's creating a crisis for imperialism, and in addition to things like the biodiversity collapse, which is often overlooked in terms of crises we think about. The system's way of sustaining itself is to become more openly fascistic. Let's see. Well, there's a debate around which specific policies you can call fascistic. I don't know if austerity in itself is fascist, but with the way that the things are going in the United States, with this push towards a militaristic paradigm and a regressive, openly racist political discourse fostered by politicians like Trump and by QAnon. Man, we haven't even started to unpack QAnon so far on this podcast. It's the definition of insanity, and I'm trying to raise awareness that what we're experiencing is a transition from the what was the more friendly looking Obama paradigm to something that more closely resembles Mussolini, and this is going to be the case whether Trump or Biden becomes the next president, because last year Biden said that nothing will fundamentally change if he becomes president. And in this reality where all these people are getting driven into poverty, and where there's this seemingly escalating crisis of racist police brutality, and where there's this migrant crisis that's prompting the forces of reaction to enact genocidal violence, the idea that nothing will fundamentally change is extremely frightening. It implies a tremendous amount of repression and reaction and injustice and violence.
Yes. I think that this is something that I've been hearing people say this for the last 20 years, since the implementation of the Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton was president through the late 90s. He implemented an act in Congress, or signed an act in Congress, sponsored it basically, that was called the Anti-Terrorism Act. And that was a precursor to the Patriot Act, which was passed just a few months after the 9/11/2001 terrorist attack on the Twin Towers, World Trade Center in New York, and the Pentagon in Virginia, in Washington, D.C., technically. It's on the Virginia side, but it's actually in D.C. I've heard people saying this over and over again, and I've argued with them that no, they're wrong. This is not what we've been living through over these last 20 plus years. Is not fascism. It's the reaction of a liberal state, a liberal capitalist state. It's liberalism. And liberalism has, throughout its history, had periods of severe repression, oppression, severe police state. All these things are not just characteristic of fascism, they're also characteristic of liberalism. However, now, in the midst of this multiple mother of all crises, the worst crisis, the United States of America as a plutocracy, as a capitalist-run, capitalist-owned criminal enterprise, the worst crisis it has ever faced, and of course we, the working class, always get dragged into it. I do believe I am seeing clear signs, regardless of who wins in the election coming up, whether it's a Biden regime or a Trump regime 2.0, we are going to see drastic steps towards fascism, because, as you pointed out in the recent weeks, it's the only way that these people will be able to do what they're determined to do, which is to continue implementing neoliberalism. Neoliberalism from this point on will require of the capitalist class that they adopt to and implement real fascism. And I think that's what we're headed for. I think Joe, pedophile Joe, as I call him, Biden, is totally committed to that process, because that's what his billionaire funders have told him to be committed to, and he's loyal. No one can say he's not loyal. He's incredibly loyal to the billionaire class, just like Hillary Clinton was before him. Trump is also totally, I believe, totally committed to this now, although I don't think he thought that he was coming into this with that approach, but he didn't know that they were going to come into this huge mother of all crises, this coalescence of multiple crises. So yes, absolutely, Rainer, well done. Really good article. And next on our list, we better hurry up because we've still got, let's see, 5 more to go. Applying Juche lessons to our revolutionary struggle in America.
Yeah, now I was inspired to write this when I found out that throughout Africa, in particular, there has been an enormous push among the socialist parties and among these African communists to try to see how they can apply Korea's model of socialism, Juche. I thought it's pronounced Juche, but maybe this is just the way that English.
Juche. You're a better expert than I am on this.
I think I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Juche. Anyway, these African comrades have wholeheartedly embraced the idea of implementing Juche within their post-colonial countries, and still in Africa, especially in the corruption and inequality-stricken country of Nigeria, there are thousands of African communists who still hold this line that Juche is applicable to them. So I mean, you see how I'm contemplating how the United States can be overthrown and how it can be replaced with a post-colonial land where these colonized nations have been liberated and are free to pursue socialism. So, I think that Juche, at the very least, has lessons to teach us on this continent, and one of those lessons intertwines with what I've been saying about how the idea of socialism with American characteristics is nonsense. It's not what we need to be working towards. America, this nebulous notion of a single so-called nation on this continent that's unified by the settler colonial ideals, it needs to be overthrown, both in terms of the state and in terms of Americanist culture, and it needs to be replaced with a post-colonial paradigm where these nations, as I say, are free to pursue socialism on their own. So I think that Juche can help teach us that that part of getting towards this paradigm is to combat the kinds of pitfalls that can dilute the strength of a proletarian anti-colonial movement. And as I say in my article, one of these pitfalls is class reductionism, which again reflects what I've been talking about. And I got a lot of the thoughts from this article by reading from a page called Juche Gang, run by my friend Shane Lawrence Pick. He's this expert on Korean socialism, and on this page he wrote how class reductionist perspective claims that that building a revolution is as simple as reaching out to the general working class in America, when really when really the colonized peoples are primarily, they're the most important segment of the proletariat. And by this I mean not that as communists we should exclude the settler working class on this continent, but that we should not budge from a staunchly anti-colonial line, and that we should recognize that the colonized portions of the proletariat are by and large more likely to join a revolution than the settler masses, because the colonized peoples are the ones who've gotten the short end of the stick, to say the least, in the American project. And a lot of these white settlers feel ideologically tied to the capitalist state because they historically they're the beneficiaries more so of empire. So this is the kind of nuance that I think we need to acknowledge as we go about our propaganda, as we go about recruiting. And it's why I think that it seems likely that the colonized peoples will be the primary ones to lead a revolution on this continent. Because frankly, I think they're more trustworthy by and large than the white working class.
Yes, absolutely. The oppressed nationalities within the United States are and have always been and will be in the vanguard of any working class movement for progressive change, for socialist change, certainly for communist for Marxist-Leninist change. They have always been, they always will be. This article, like the earlier one that you had on anti-colonial revolution will come before socialist revolution. I have some quibbles, mainly because I have a great fear of the idea of introducing nationalism in the United States in any way, shape, or form. Down that road lies fascism. Down that road lies a real nightmare. And Juche is one of the few primary tenets of Juche is that it is a eminently nationalist, and which makes perfect sense in the context of Korea and the Korea people's struggle for liberation from imperialist overlords. It is appropriate there. Lenin speaks a lot about this idea that nationalism, in the context of anti-imperialist national liberation struggles, is a clearly a progressive movement, even when it's led by the indigenous capitalist classes, which it has been at some times. That is, we still should support that national liberation struggle. However, in the context of an imperialist country, nationalism becomes its opposite. Nationalism becomes reactionaryism. Nationalism is a deadly threat to the working class. I don't know, call me a class reductionist if you want to. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. I'm not a class reductionist, but I do believe, and I feel like I have a lot of evidence backing this up, that the working class will lead any socialist revolution in this country, and that the working class is the class with revolutionary potential. There's obviously a strong minority of people within the working class, mostly white people, as it happens. There's no surprise there. Who are reactionary, who are part of the aristocracy of labor, as Lenin called it. Anyway, those are my hesitations about this idea of implementing or encouraging the adoption of Korean Juche in the context of the United States. I am a firm believer and firmly committed to internationalism. I am an internationalist through and through, and I believe that with the entire working class, including the oppressed nationalities, which constitute pretty close to a majority of the working class, they constitute at least a large minority of probably 40 to 45% of the working class. Even there, I believe that Marxist-Leninists need to be promoting internationalism, not nationalism. Now, within that, yes, if there were, for instance, as in the 1920s and 30s, within the Black community, especially under Marcus Garvey's influence, there was a major, it was still pretty minority view, but there was a major movement for the establishment of a Black nation in America, in this southeast part of the United States of America. And if such a movement ever rises again, yes, we'd have to totally rethink this. because that would be an authentic nationalist struggle, an authentic nationalist struggle towards the idea of the development of a black nation where black people are the majority, which is the way that was constituted at that time. Of course, demographics have shifted somewhat, but still the South is certainly the blackest part of America, even to this day.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts. Like I said before, I can be changed on all this, but these are, pretty deeply ingrained in me, having studied Marxism, Leninism for at least the last 45 years and totally committed to it. There's where I stand. I believe in self-determination.
Yeah. Well,
Strongly.
you make the distinction between authentic and inauthentic nationalism, or rather, good versus evil nationalism, and
No,
this
I never said good versus evil.
I consider I could consider it such a difference, because the
I'm just
effects of
saying authentic in the context of, is there something there? Is there a there? And in this case, the idea of applying Juche to the American situation, there's no there. Now, I don't know, in the future, maybe you can build something up, but you don't have much time, because we're all going to be wiped out if we don't hurry up with what we need to do.
well,
So,
this is this distinction I try to make when I say that we should reject socialism with American characteristics, and to try to build a kind of socialist nationalism that exists within the uh, structure that builds upon the legacy of colonialism, and that retains the American type identity. I think that Americanism needs to be erased, so that we can then build up these new nations that arise from these liberated, oppressed nationalities. And in that context, I don't see the harm in applying Juche. It would be no more harmful than the way that Korea has applied Juche. This is the context that I try to firmly establish when I advocate for Juche, because I think it's why my friend Shane Lawrence Pick has taken the care to repudiate socialism with American characteristics, because I can definitely see how trying to apply this nationalistic kind of ideology to something Americanist would be harmful, and it would lead to a sort of fascism. So these are the kinds of distinctions that are important to make.
well, yeah, I mean, obviously, in any socialist revolution, that revolution has to take account of the peculiarities of a nation, of the cultural peculiarities, of the political, social, even in many cases, the economic peculiarities of a nation, the traditions, the deep ingrained stuff. You have to take account of that. So, I mean, if it were between the two, between adopting nationalism in the United States of America, which I see as reactionary, and adopting socialism with American characteristics, well, as long as that socialism is internationalist and not nationalist, yeah, I think that's fine. But adopting any sort of nationalism in the United States, other than our support for oppressed nationalities and what they want, that's the key here: self-determination. So anyway, I don't think we'll move a lot farther, and we've only got 22 minutes left, or thereabouts. I mean, we can fudge it a little bit. So I want to, with your permission, of course, I want to move on to more than 3,000 companies are suing the federal government over Trump's trade war. Now, this that's an exact quote from the headline of the video. It comes from RT. You can look it up on RT.com or RTAmerica.com and find it. But to me, this was quite astounding. It's 3,000 companies in the United States have been miffed enough, have been hurt enough that they joined together in lawsuits against the federal government and the Trump regime over Trump's trade rule and trade policies, and especially over his tariffs, which, as we all know, Trump is lying to people when he tells them, oh, China will pay for the tariffs. No, China doesn't pay us a red dime for these tariffs that have been placed on Chinese goods. American consumers, mostly American working class, pay for those tariffs. And people are really getting miffed about it. These are 3,000, actually it's 3,500 companies. I just said more than 3,000 companies suing the federal government over this. So it's we'll see, but to me, this is quite an astounding thing. Capitalists are suing the capitalist government.
Right, and it's another part of this trend that we've been seeing in this last year or so of the Cold War with China hurting U.S. capitalism. We've seen it with the TikTok fiasco, where Trump was causing this chaos in big tech as part of his effort to strong arm this social media app from China. And we're seeing it all, not just in the U.S. and Australia, but with Australia's going along with Washington's economic isolationism towards China, and how this has exacerbated Australia's economic downturn this year, because Australia is a country that's largely dependent on its ties to Chinese industry, and when it's cut off, this hurts Australia a lot more than it does China, and the same is the case for the U.S. So this is I feel like there's this reflects some specific contradiction of imperialism, but I don't know. I feel like it's in the tip of my tongue, but I can't quite name it. I mean, that this has contradictions written all over it. This phenomena of Washington cutting off China economically, and then these businesses getting hurt in the process, and the average people having to pay for it. So this is the trend we'll continue to see, where unlike was the case with the last Cold War, as the New Deal drastically expanded the U.S. economy and brought great prosperity to the middle class. Now we're seeing a great downturn in prosperity, and the businesses are getting hurt so badly. So I guess this is a detriment that the U.S. wasn't experiencing during its last Cold War.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, moving right along. We've only got 18 minutes now. COVID-19, how 3 prior pandemics triggered massive societal shifts. And this current plague, the COVID-19 plague, is going to be just one more in the same kind of same kind of thing, basically, of this um, this uh, uh, current plague leading to enormous, massive societal shifts. And I believe the same thing is happening and will happen, as happened in these three other pandemics. The first one was a pandemic that it's believed to have been uh, uh, scarlet fever, I think, or was it scarlet fever? I was trying to look for the article, but I couldn't find it here. The first pandemic was in Rome in the 200s CE, that is the Common Era. That's the same the Christians call it, the after Christ, the AD, but during that time, and this pandemic lasted at least 100 years, probably 1/3 to 1/2 of the Roman population, not just in Rome, of course. When I'm talking about the Roman population, I'm talking about the entire Roman Empire, which surrounded all of the Mediterranean, reached up into Gaul, which is now France, reached up into Great Britain, and into parts of Germany, what is now called Germany. 1/3 to 1/2 of all the people died. And a lot of observers credit this with the death of paganism and the introduction, the bringing in of the Christian cult as the official state religion of the Roman Empire, which is obviously the enormous cultural shift. But it also had a great impact on the existence of slavery, because, of course, slavery was the basis of the Roman economic system. And then a few hundred years later, in the 500s CE, plague called the Justinian plague, named after the Roman emperor Justinian. By then, the whole western half of the Roman Empire had collapsed. That's called the fall. A lot of Westerners misnamed this as the fall of the Roman Empire. It wasn't the fall of the Roman Empire, it was just the fall of the western half, or the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, which the Eurocentric racists call the Byzantine Empire, but which no one in the Eastern Roman Empire during its entire 1,000-year history beyond the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They lasted until the 1400s. No one ever referred to themselves, if they lived in the Eastern Roman Empire, as Byzantines or the Byzantine Empire. It was just not a thing. What they called themselves was Romans, even though they did not live in Rome, obviously, for most of that time. Although during Justinian's period in the 540s, 550s, and there, Rome was reconquered, a lot of Italy was reconquered, a lot of the empire was reconquered. Justinian was a phenomenally successful emperor. However, starting in the 550s, another pandemic happened, another plague, as they used to call it in the old days. And this time, it was actually the bubonic plague, or a form of the bubonic plague, which we know of as the Black Death in the 1300s in Europe. But once again, this wiped out an enormous, probably a third of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire. And it moved the economy almost totally away from slavery into a feudal economy. It moved the Roman Empire into feudalism, basically into adopting feudalism, which had already spread throughout most of Western Europe by that time. And it was once again, an enormous sea change in their society. Then, in the 1300s, there was the Black Death, the bubonic plague, starting in 1340s, the early 1340s in what's now called Russia, but moving from there. It was a disease that was carried by the fleas that rode on the backs of rats. And so because the Black Death, the bubonic plague was a time already of great poverty, it just promoted these kind of things. Just like today in the world, we're seeing a lot of increase in poverty, and it is promoting these outbreaks of new plagues, new viruses, new pandemics. I call them plagues because that's what traditionally they've always been called, and that's what this COVID-19 is. And in that really started 1/3 to 1/2 again of all Europeans were wiped out by that plague. And it depopulated huge parts of Europe. And it did a couple of things. It promoted the rise of capitalists. The first capitalists started rising up after that. They were nowhere near being the ruling class of any of those European countries at that time. But that's where they got their beginning. They got some elbow room because of the plague to begin that. It was the beginning of the rise of capitalism and the beginning of the end of feudalism. So there again, you see this enormous change. What will happen in our plague, the COVID plague? I hesitate to speculate, but having been committed to the socialist revolution my entire life, with a few breaks where I got kind of discouraged and went in a reformist direction, but basically even then I still believed in revolutionary socialism, in communism, in other words. In all that time, I've been committed to that, and I see lots of signs all around me that people are changing. Even the white working class is changing, and that they're moving towards something as they become more and more impoverished, as they become more and more pushed into the gutter by these multiple crises descending on them all at once. So I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but that's the direction I see things going in ultimately, as well as the fascism that we're going to have to fight.
Yeah, there's like 7 minutes, and I want to end it after it gets to what like 10. So anyway, I've also been looking at history a little bit of plagues and how it's certainly notable that this famous plague in the 14th century, was it, that drastically changed labor relations and helped. I also know that this plague that Europe experienced helped spur the development from feudalism to a more modernized, something that resembles our world today, and that spurred some progressive advancements, and also, of course, the capitalist injustices that led to all the evil that we see in the world today. But as for COVID-19, how it's going to measure up, well, firstly, COVID-19 so far is not nearly as deadly in numbers as those earlier plagues. So far, it's something like 1 million deaths, but this is just it's not even been a year since this plague really got going. So maybe it's going to get a lot worse than I'd assume it'll be. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but either way, so far we've seen evidence that COVID-19 is drastically accelerating the collapse of capitalism. I mentioned earlier how COVID-19 has so far driven tens of millions into extreme poverty around the world. By the end of this year, it's estimated by the World Bank, by the neoliberal World Bank, even, that something like 150 million perhaps will be driven into extreme poverty due to economic deprivation issues related to the pandemic. So this is certainly spurring on the exacerbation of contradictions of capitalism. And like I said around the beginning of the podcast, it's going to lead a lot of people to the conclusion that proletarian revolution is a practical necessity. I mean, those graphs you showed me blew me away, and if everyone were to see them, it would be easy to make the case just how broken this system is, how unable this system is to provide a stable livelihood, both to that 1/4 of the country that's unemployed and to the majority of the country now, it seems, that you could say is living in poverty. And so hopefully, hopefully this latest plague will be what spurs on the development towards a new economic paradigm. But before that can take place, we're going to need to do the work to build the organizations and that can take on the capitalist state, and we're going to need to win over the majority of the population towards the idea of overthrowing the state and replacing it with a socialist worker state.
Right. Yes, that is correct in all ways. The future is always hard to say for sure, but I see it going in that direction as well. The one thing we have today that we didn't have in the 14th century or any time prior to that is science. And most countries in the world have applied science. And that's why, for instance, China only had 5,000 deaths, even though it is 4 times larger in population than the United States. Most countries in the world applied science. Here in the United States, we have a dictator, a regime, an emperor, Emperor Trump, who is committed to anti-science, to everything against science. And that's why we are number one in this one, only in this one thing. We are number one. We are number one in COVID deaths. We are number one. And I believe totally, because the epidemiologists tell me so, that this plague is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. We're only through phase 1, like we were talking about before. First wave, we haven't even started the second wave. And as I've told people, in 1918, during the last major plague in the United States, the so-called Spanish flu, the misnamed Spanish flu. The first wave, 3 million people died worldwide. The second wave, 50 million people died worldwide. So once again, I think that those scientific countries will beat this back. And those countries that are anti-science, like America's leadership has been, will not. So there we have it. I don't know if you want to say any, we didn't get to lack of social cohesion or to the industrial meltdown of industrial society, which is unfortunate. I think we could just pick those up next week because they're not time sensitive. I don't know if you want to say a few words and build up the anticipation in the meantime.
Oh, and in those articles, I more explore the facets of our capitalist collapse that we've just touched upon, of the presence of crises like COVID-19, which you say is going to get a lot worse, which it's very scary to contemplate it getting a lot worse from here on, and also the climate crisis and the ongoing global depression that's probably going to get worse throughout this next decade. So next week we're gonna talk all about those.
Exactly. Okay, well done, Rainer. Thank you so much. Thank the audience for tuning in. Look for us on YouTube, of course, and a few other places if I can, platforms if I can figure out how to get on there. So that's it for us for now until next week. Thanks for joining us. So long, Rainer.
So long.
Okay. Where the hell? Oh, there we go.